In the spring of 1949, a boy who would one day remake American cinema lay quarantined in a bedroom in Queens, watching shadows move across the wallpaper. He was 10 years old, and he had polio. The world outside continued without him, the neighborhood streets, the school he could not attend, his brother moving freely through rooms he could no longer enter without effort. He had a television for company, a squat box with a small gray screen, and through it came the early transmissions of another world, variety shows, westerns, the flickering grammar of stories told in moving pictures. His father was a musician, a flautist who played in orchestras and radio sessions, moving between gigs with the perpetual anxiety of the freelance artist. His mother had been an actress before marriage, reshaped her life into something smaller and more domestic. They were Italian-American, first generation on his father's side, and the household carried that particular combination of old-world intensity and new-world ambition, the sense that culture mattered, that art was not decoration but sustenance, even as the rent was always a concern and the future never entirely secure. The boy's name was Francis, though everyone called him by his middle name too, Ford, after the car manufacturer, his father's tribute to American possibility, to the machines and dreams that defined the mid-century landscape. Francis Ford Coppola. Even the name had a kind of grandiosity to it, a weight that suggested someone who might do something large. But for now he was just a sick child in a darkened room, his legs weakened by illness, his world contracted to the dimensions of a bed and the blue glow of the television screen. He watched everything. He developed favorites. He began to understand, in the way children understand things before they have words for them, that stories had shapes, that images could be arranged to create feeling, that there was a language being spoken through cuts and close-ups, and the way a camera might linger on a face or pull back to reveal a landscape. It was an education that happened almost by accident, the residue of isolation, but it planted something in him that would take decades to fully emerge. When he recovered enough to leave the bedroom, the world he returned to was the same, but also different. He had changed. He remained a fragile child, not athletic, not particularly social, someone who lived more in his head than in his body. His father's career continued its uncertain trajectory, the family moving between boroughs, between apartments, between moments of modest success and stretches of financial worry. Carmine Coppola was a talented musician, respected by his peers, but talent and respect did not always translate into stability. The household was loud with argument and affection, Italian in its emotional volume, its willingness to let feeling spill into every corner of domestic life. Francis absorbed it all, the arguments about money, the passionate discussions of art and music, the sense that creative work was both a calling and a kind of curse, something you could not escape even when it failed to pay the bills. He was not a natural student in the conventional sense, but he was curious, obsessive when something caught his attention. He had a younger sister, Talia, who would later become an actress and filmmaker herself, part of the constellation of artists that seemed to orbit the family. The Coppola household was not wealthy or connected, but it was alive with the sense that art was what mattered, that the life of the imagination was the life worth living, even if it meant struggle. Francis internalized this ethos without entirely understanding its implications. He began making little films with an 8mm camera, staging scenes with neighborhood kids, experimenting with editing by cutting and splicing the film strips with tape. These early efforts were crude, the work of a teenager with more ambition than skill, but they gave him a sense of control he had not felt since before the polio, a way of shaping the world rather than simply enduring it. By the time he reached adolescence, he had fixed on cinema as the thing he wanted to pursue. Not acting. He was too self-conscious, too aware of his own awkwardness, but making films, orchestrating the whole apparatus the way a conductor might lead an orchestra. His father understood this impulse, even if he worried about its practicality. The 1950s were ending, and American culture was in a peculiar state of transition. The studio system that had dominated Hollywood for decades was beginning to crack. Television had siphoned off audiences. The old certainties were fading. But in Europe, something else was happening. The French New Wave was gathering force, Godard and Truffaut and the others rewriting the rules of what cinema could be. The Italians, Fellini, Antonioni, Rossellini, were making films of profound sophistication and emotional depth. The Japanese were exporting the visions of Kurosawa and Ozu. For a young person serious about film, the message was clear. Cinema was not just entertainment, it was art, capable of expressing the full range of human experience, and it was being remade in real time by directors who saw themselves as auteurs, authors of their own visions. Francis applied to UCLA's film school, one of the few places in America where you could formally study cinema as an art form. He was accepted, and in 1960 he moved west to Los Angeles, leaving behind the tight urban density of New York for the sprawling sunlit strangeness of Southern California. Film school in those years was still a marginal affair, not yet the professionalized pipeline to the industry it would later become. The students were a mix of misfits and dreamers, young people who had decided that Hollywood's gatekeepers could be circumvented through skill and audacity. Francis threw himself into the work with manic energy. He directed student films that were ambitious to the point of impracticality, 20-minute narratives with multiple locations and elaborate setups when most of his peers were making simple exercises. He studied the masters obsessively, Eisenstein's theories of montage, the long takes of Mizoguchi, the emotional nakedness of Italian neorealism. He began to develop a sense of what he wanted cinema to do, to combine the visual sophistication of the Europeans with the narrative drive and genre pleasures of classical Hollywood, to make films that were both popular and profound, that could reach mass audiences without condescending to them. This ambition was not unique among his peers. The film schools of the 1960s were full of young men, and they were almost all men who believed they could change American cinema, who saw the European art film as a model and a challenge. George Lucas was a few years behind Francis at USC, another earnest cinephile with grand dreams. Martin Scorsese was at NYU, absorbing the textures of Italian Catholicism and New York street life. Steven Spielberg was trying to break into the industry without the benefit of formal training, relying on raw talent and hustle. Paul Schrader, Brian De Palma, Peter Bogdanovich, a whole generation was gathering, shaped by the same influences, driven by the same hunger to prove that Hollywood could make art. They did not know each other yet, not most of them, but they were part of the same historical moment, the same rupture in American culture that would eventually be called New Hollywood. Francis graduated from UCLA in 1963 and immediately faced the problem that every film school graduate faces: how to actually make films. The industry was not waiting for him. The studios were in disarray, churning out expensive failures, unsure of what audiences wanted. Independent filmmaking existed only at the margins, lacking the infrastructure or financing to sustain a real alternative. Francis needed work, needed money, needed a way in. He took whatever he could find. He worked for Roger Corman, the king of low-budget exploitation films, a producer-director who made cheap horror and science fiction movies on impossible schedules, and somehow turned a profit. Corman was a contradiction, a Yale graduate who made schlock, a serious man who understood the grammar of popular cinema and was willing to teach it to anyone willing to work hard enough. He gave young filmmakers opportunities they could not find anywhere else, as long as they delivered on time and on budget. Francis worked as a dialogue director, a sound man, an assistant of all trades on Corman's productions. He absorbed everything. Corman's method was simple: shoot fast, use every available resource, never waste a take, finish the film. If it was art, that was a bonus. What mattered was that it was watchable and could be sold. Francis learned practical filmmaking in these trenches, the unglamorous work of getting images onto celluloid, under conditions that allowed for no perfectionism. He also learned something about the business, about how films were financed and marketed, about the machinery that existed beneath the surface of the dream factory. This education would prove crucial later when he had the opportunity to make his own films and needed to understand not just the art but the economics, the leverage that came from controlling a film's commercial potential. In 1962, while still at UCLA, he had met a young woman named Eleanor Neal at a party. She was poised and intelligent, interested in the arts, someone who could see past his nervous energy and awkward intensity to the ambition underneath. They married quickly, the way young people did in that era, and Eleanor became not just his wife, but his collaborator, a partner who would document his work, support his most reckless decisions, and somehow hold together the domestic life, even as his career veered between triumph and catastrophe. Their marriage would be tested in ways neither of them could have anticipated, but in the early years it was a source of stability, a foundation from which Francis could take the risks his career would require. His first real break came in 1966 when he was hired to write a screenplay for a studio picture. The film was called Is Paris Burning?, a war epic about the liberation of Paris, and it was being produced by a major studio with a significant budget. Francis co-wrote the script with Gore Vidal, an established literary figure, and the experience was both exhilarating and humiliating. The script went through endless revisions, subjected to the whims of producers and stars. The final film was a muddled mess, a commercial failure, but Francis had been paid, and more importantly, he had a credit. He was now, technically, a professional screenwriter. He followed this with another assignment, adapting a Tennessee Williams one-act play into a screenplay called This Property is Condemned, starring Natalie Wood and Robert Redford. Again, the process was frustrating, the final product compromised, but Francis was learning how the system worked, how scripts were developed and mangled, how creative vision was negotiated and often surrendered in the machinery of production. In 1967, he directed his first feature film, a low-budget thriller called You're a Big Boy Now, about a shy young man coming of age in New York City. The film was modest in scope, but ambitious in style, influenced by the playful energy of the French New Wave and the British films of the 60s, full of jump cuts and handheld camera work and a loose, improvisational feel. It was not a hit, but it was noticed. Critics saw that here was a young director with a distinctive eye, someone who understood European modernism but was interested in American subjects, in the textures of contemporary life. Francis submitted the film as his master's thesis at UCLA, a brazen move that suggested he saw no meaningful distinction between the academic study of cinema and the practice of making it. The school accepted it. He had his degree, and he had his first feature. He was 28 years old. But the late 1960s were not an easy time to be a young filmmaker trying to establish a career. The studios were collapsing financially, producing expensive failures like Dr. Dolittle and Star that nearly bankrupted them. The old guard directors, the craftsmen who had sustained Hollywood through the 40s and 50s, were aging out, and the new generation had not yet proven they could deliver hits. Francis directed another film for Warner Brothers in 1968, a musical called Finian's Rainbow, starring Fred Astaire. It was an odd choice, a dated property that felt out of step with the moment, but Francis approached it seriously, trying to bring visual invention to a creaky narrative. The film was another commercial disappointment. He was now 0 for 2 as a Hollywood director, and the industry was taking notice of the failures more than the potential. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He needed a success, something that would prove he could deliver not just interesting images, but a film people would actually pay to see. He had been writing screenplays steadily, trying to keep money coming in, and one of his scripts, Patton, about the controversial World War II general, was circulating in Hollywood. The script was unconventional, opening with Patton delivering a monologue in front of a giant American flag, a scene that would become iconic, but which many in the industry thought was too strange, too theatrical. Francis saw Patton as a deeply contradictory figure, a warrior poet, a man out of time even in his own era, someone who embodied both the grandeur and the madness of American military power. The script eventually went into production, directed by Franklin J. Schaffner and starring George C. Scott, and it became a massive hit, winning the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1971. Francis won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay, though he was not present at the ceremony to accept it. The success vindicated his writing, but it also underscored the frustration of his position. He could write films that won Oscars, but he could not direct films that succeeded. During this period, he and George Lucas and a few other young filmmakers had formed a kind of informal collective, talking about creating an alternative to the Hollywood system, a place where they could make films on their own terms. They founded a company called American Zoetrope, based in San Francisco, far from the studio apparatus. The name was taken from an early animation device, a spinning wheel of images, a reference to cinema's prehistory and a signal of their ambitions, to return to first principles, to reclaim the pure possibilities of the medium before it had been industrialized. The venture was idealistic and underfunded, more a statement of intent than a functional business. Warner Brothers gave them a development deal to produce a slate of low-budget films, but when Francis showed the studio executives George Lucas's debut feature, THX 1138, a dystopian science fiction film that was cold, abstract, and defiantly uncommercial, the deal fell apart. The studio wanted its money back. Zoetrope was suddenly in debt, and Francis was personally liable. He was 31 years old, married with 2 young children, and he was functionally bankrupt. The dream of an independent production company was collapsing before it had really begun. Hollywood saw him as talented but unreliable, someone who could write but maybe could not direct, someone whose artistic ambitions kept getting in the way of commercial viability. He needed work, and he was in no position to be choosy. So when Paramount Pictures offered him a job directing an adaptation of a popular novel, he accepted, even though he did not particularly want to make the film. The novel was called The Godfather. The book by Mario Puzo was a bestseller, a sprawling melodrama about an Italian-American crime family in New York, filled with violence and intrigue and operatic emotion. It was pulp, elevated by Puzo's genuine feeling for the immigrant experience and the codes of loyalty and honor that governed life in the mafia, but it was still, in the eyes of many, a piece of commercial fiction, not the stuff of serious cinema. Paramount had bought the rights because the book had sold millions of copies, but the studio was in terrible financial shape and could not afford to spend much on the production. They wanted a cheap gangster picture, something that would capitalize on the book's popularity without risking too much money. They hired Francis because he was Italian-American, which they thought would give the film authenticity, and because he was available and would work for a modest fee. Francis almost turned it down. He had read the book and thought it was sensationalistic, a collection of lurid set pieces that pandered to the worst stereotypes about Italian-Americans. But he was broke, and he needed the work, and his wife Eleanor and his friend George Lucas both told him the same thing. Take the job, make the movie, use the money to pay off your debts, and fund the projects you actually care about. So he said yes, and then he set about trying to figure out how to make a gangster picture into something more than a gangster picture. He began by rereading the novel and finding in it threads he could follow, themes he could foreground. Underneath the melodrama, Puzo had written about family, about the tension between old-world values and American capitalism, about the way power corrupts and isolates, about the immigrant dream curdling into something dark. Francis saw The Godfather not as a crime story, but as a tragedy, a story about the loss of innocence, about a man who thinks he can avoid his family's sins and ends up embodying them. He saw it as a film about America itself, about the way the country's promises and its violence are inextricable, about how the pursuit of success requires moral compromise and how that compromise destroys the soul. He cast the film carefully, fighting the studio at almost every turn. Paramount wanted a star to play Michael Corleone, the war hero who becomes the family's new Don. They suggested Robert Redford, Warren Beatty, Jack Nicholson, actors who were bankable, who could open a movie. Francis wanted Al Pacino, a young stage actor who had done almost no film work, someone intense and interior and unreadable, someone who could convey Michael's transformation from idealist to tyrant without telegraphing it. The studio resisted. Pacino was unknown, too short, too ethnic. Francis insisted. He threatened to quit if he could not cast Pacino. Eventually, grudgingly, the studio relented. For the role of Don Vito Corleone, the aging patriarch, Paramount wanted a safe choice, someone established, but not too expensive. Francis wanted Marlon Brando, who was at that point considered box office poison, a difficult actor whose last several films had been failures. The studio said no. Francis made a screen test, filming Brando in his own home, with tissue stuffed in his cheeks to age his face and darken his hair with shoe polish, and the footage was mesmerizing. Brando had found something ancient and weary in the character, a dignity that suggested whole lifetimes of experience. Francis showed the test to the studio, and they relented again, though only on the condition that Brando work for a minimal salary and post a bond for his good behavior. The production was difficult from the start. Paramount's executives were nervous about Francis, about his youth and his lack of a commercial track record. They sent representatives to the set who watched his every move, looking for reasons to fire him. There were rumors throughout the shoot that he would be replaced, that the studio was lining up Elia Kazan or another established director to take over. Francis pushed forward, shooting the film the way he saw it, slow, dark, operatic, more like a European art film than a Hollywood thriller. He filmed in real locations in New York, in dim interiors lit to look like Caravaggio paintings, emphasizing shadow and texture over clarity. He let scenes play out in long takes, trusting his actors to hold the frame, to create tension through stillness and silence rather than through fast cutting and action beats. He made choices that seemed uncommercial, that seemed designed to alienate a mass audience. He filmed a wedding sequence that ran nearly half an hour, introducing characters with minimal exposition, trusting the audience to follow the rhythms of the family gathering, to absorb the social world of the Corleones through observation rather than explanation. The studio hated the footage. They thought it was too dark, too slow, too plotless. The dailies looked murky on the small screens in the executive screening rooms, and the story seemed to meander. Francis was nearly fired multiple times. He kept shooting, kept assembling the film in his head, kept trusting that if he could just get to the editing room, he could make it work. He was exhausted, terrified, working 20-hour days, fighting constantly with the producers, trying to protect his vision while also delivering something the studio could sell. He later said that making The Godfather was the worst experience of his career, that he felt like a fraud, like an imposter who was about to be exposed and humiliated. But he kept going. When the film was finally assembled and screened for the studio, something shifted. The executives saw that what Francis had made was not just a gangster picture, but something richer and stranger, a film that moved at its own pace, that drew you into its world and held you there, that made you care about people who were, objectively, criminals and murderers. The film had a gravity, a seriousness that elevated the material. It was nearly 3 hours long, which was almost unheard of for a genre picture, but it did not feel long. It felt immersive, complete, a world fully realized. Paramount decided to release it with minimal cuts, to trust Francis's instincts even though they had doubted him at every stage of production. The Godfather opened in March of 1972, and it became a cultural phenomenon. It was not just a hit, it was an event. Audiences lined up around the block. Critics, who had been prepared to dismiss it as a piece of exploitation, found themselves writing about it as if it were Shakespearean tragedy. The film made stars of Al Pacino and James Caan and Robert Duvall. It reintroduced Marlon Brando to a generation that had written him off. It made Francis Ford Coppola, overnight, one of the most important directors in American cinema. The film went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, and Francis won for Best Adapted Screenplay, though he lost Best Director to Bob Fosse for Cabaret. But the loss hardly mattered. The Godfather was the biggest film of the year, eventually the highest-grossing film in history to that point, and it had changed Francis's life completely. Suddenly he was not a struggling filmmaker trying to pay off debts. He was a major director, someone the studios wanted to work with, someone whose next project would be greenlighted without question. He had leverage, the thing he had wanted since the beginning, the ability to make the films he wanted on his own terms. But he was also, in a way he did not fully understand yet, trapped. The Godfather was such an enormous success, such a defining cultural artifact, that everything he did afterward would be measured against it. He had made a masterpiece, and masterpieces cast long shadows. Paramount immediately wanted a sequel, which was unusual at the time. Hollywood did not routinely make sequels to dramas. That was something reserved for genre pictures and franchises. But The Godfather had made so much money that the studio saw it as a franchise, as something that could be extended, exploited. Francis resisted at first. He thought the story was complete, that a sequel would be redundant, a cash grab that would diminish the original. But Paramount made him an offer he found difficult to refuse: total creative control, a large budget, and a percentage of the profits. He could make the sequel the way he wanted, with no studio interference, and if it succeeded, he would be wealthy enough to fund his own projects forever, to build the independent production company he had dreamed of. He agreed, on the condition that he could write the screenplay with Mario Puzo and that the film would not simply rehash the original but would expand the story, go deeper, explore new terrain. Francis conceived The Godfather Part 2 as something unprecedented, a sequel that was also a prequel, a film that would move backward and forward in time simultaneously, interweaving the story of Michael Corleone's consolidation of power in the 1950s with the story of his father Vito's rise from poverty in the early 20th century. It was a structure that required immense confidence, that asked audiences to hold two narratives in their heads at once, to see the parallels and contrasts, to understand how the son was repeating and also inverting the father's trajectory. Vito, played by Robert De Niro in the flashback sequences, builds the family's power through loyalty and cunning, maintaining his humanity even as he becomes a criminal. Michael, played again by Al Pacino, destroys everyone around him in his quest to protect the family, becoming isolated and monstrous, losing the very things he set out to preserve. The film would be a tragedy of repetition, of the way history recurs and transforms, of the way the sins of the fathers are visited upon the sons. The production was sprawling, shot in multiple locations: New York, Lake Tahoe, Sicily, the Dominican Republic standing in for Cuba. Francis had a much larger budget this time, and the studio, chastened by the success of the first film, gave him the freedom he had demanded. But freedom brought its own pressures. The first Godfather had been made under constraints, and those constraints had focused Francis, had forced him to be disciplined, to make every shot count. Now he had resources, and he used them ambitiously, perhaps too ambitiously, staging elaborate set pieces, filming scenes that would ultimately be cut from the final film, allowing the project to expand in ways that were artistically exciting, but logistically daunting. The shoot was long and expensive, and there were moments when it seemed the film might spiral out of control, might become too diffuse, too complicated, but Francis in the editing room was decisive. He cut ruthlessly, shaping the two timelines into a coherent whole, using cross-cutting to create echoes and ironies, to make the audience feel the weight of the past on the present. The film's structure was novelistic, literary in a way that American films rarely attempted, and yet it retained the visual power of the original, the dark, burnished beauty of Gordon Willis's cinematography, the operatic swell of Nino Rota's score. The centerpiece of the film was Michael's moral disintegration, Pacino's face growing colder and more remote as the film progressed, until in the final shot he sits alone, having destroyed or driven away everyone who loved him, his face a mask, his victory hollow and complete. It is one of the great performances in American cinema, a portrait of a man who has won everything and lost himself. The Godfather Part 2 was released in December of 1974, and it was received as a triumph, not just a successful sequel, but a film that equaled and perhaps even surpassed the original. Critics wrote about it in tones usually reserved for literature, comparing Francis to Tolstoy and Balzac, talking about the film as if it were a great American novel translated into cinema. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and this time Francis won Best Director. The two Godfather films, taken together, represented an achievement unmatched in American movies, a 6-hour epic about family, power, and the corruption of the American dream, a story told with novelistic depth and cinematic grandeur, a work that was both massively popular and uncompromisingly serious. Francis was 35 years old, and he had directed two of the greatest films in the history of the medium, but he was restless. He did not want to spend the rest of his career making Godfather films, even though Paramount would have happily financed a third and a fourth, and as many as he was willing to make. He wanted to prove he could do something else, something that would take him out of the world of organized crime and into new territory. He had been reading Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, the story of a man traveling up the Congo River into the interior of Africa in search of a rogue ivory trader named Kurtz, who has gone mad and set himself up as a god among the natives. Francis saw in the novel a story about Vietnam, about American power and its corruption, about the way empire drives men insane. He began to conceive of a film that would transplant Conrad's story to Southeast Asia, that would use the structure of a journey into darkness as a way of exploring what the war had done to the American psyche. The project that would become Apocalypse Now was ambitious to the point of madness, an attempt to make a war film that was also a hallucinatory art film, a genre picture that was also a philosophical meditation. Francis wanted to shoot in the jungle, to capture the heat and chaos and moral ambiguity of the war, to make a film that felt like a fever dream. He began developing the screenplay with John Milius, a fellow film school graduate and one of the wilder figures of the new Hollywood generation, a gun enthusiast and surf fanatic who had written the script for Dirty Harry and who saw Vietnam as a kind of mythic testing ground for American masculinity. Milius's script was operatic and excessive, full of memorable dialogue and surreal set pieces, and Francis took it and began revising, shaping it, making it stranger and more personal. The production was supposed to begin in early 1976, shooting in the Philippines, where the government would provide helicopters and logistical support in exchange for a fee. The plan was to shoot for a few months, a relatively quick and efficient production, but from the beginning, things went wrong. The film's original star, Harvey Keitel, was not working out. Francis felt he was playing the role too tough, too conventionally, and after a few weeks of shooting, he fired him and replaced him with Martin Sheen, a more interior actor, someone who could convey the numbness and dislocation Francis wanted for the protagonist, Captain Willard. Then a typhoon hit the Philippines and destroyed many of the sets, delaying production for weeks. Then Marlon Brando, who had been cast as Colonel Kurtz, the rogue officer Willard is sent to kill, arrived on set vastly overweight and having not read the source material, requiring Francis to rewrite the character's scenes on the fly. Then Martin Sheen had a heart attack in the middle of the jungle, nearly dying, and production shut down while he recovered. The shoots stretched from months into a year, then into more than a year. Francis was living in the jungle, away from his family, rewriting the script constantly, trying to figure out what the film was even about, what Kurtz represented, how the story should end. He had scenes and sequences, extraordinary footage of helicopters attacking a village to the sound of Wagner, of a USO show descending into chaos, of a boat moving upriver through landscapes that looked like the end of the world. But he did not have an ending, did not have a coherent vision of what it all meant. The production became legendary for its chaos, its cost overruns, its sense of spiraling out of control. Francis himself began to crack under the pressure, the isolation, the weight of trying to make a film that was becoming, in his mind, a reflection of the war itself, unwinnable and incomprehensible. Eleanor documented the production with a camera, filming her husband's breakdowns, recording his doubts and fears, and this footage would later become the documentary Hearts of Darkness, a harrowing portrait of a man trying to make art under impossible conditions and nearly destroying himself in the process. Francis famously said at one point, "My film is not about Vietnam. It is Vietnam. The way we made it is the way the Americans were in Vietnam. We had too much money, too much equipment, and little by little, we went insane." When he finally finished shooting and returned to California to edit, he had hundreds of hours of footage and no clear sense of how to shape it into a coherent film. He spent months in the editing room, trying different versions, different endings, none of them quite working. He mortgaged his house, his vineyard, everything he owned, to finish the film, because the budget had ballooned far beyond what United Artists had agreed to finance, and he was personally liable for the overages. If the film failed, he would be ruined. The pressure was immense, and the work was agonizing. He cut scenes he loved because they did not fit the rhythm. He tried voiceover narration to give the film coherence, hiring Michael Hare, the author of Dispatches, to write Willard's interior monologue, and the narration helped, gave the film a literary quality, a sense of a man trying to make sense of an experience that defied sense. Apocalypse Now premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 1979 in a version that was still not entirely finished, the ending still uncertain. Francis introduced the film by saying, "My film is not a movie. It's not about Vietnam. It is Vietnam, and the way we made it was very much like the way the Americans were in Vietnam." The screening was a sensation, and the film won the Palme d'Or, sharing the prize with The Tin Drum. When it was released commercially a few months later, it was met with awe and confusion in roughly equal measure. Critics recognized it as a monumental achievement, a film that pushed the boundaries of what commercial cinema could do, but some found it incoherent, overblown, a beautiful mess. Audiences were divided. It was not the kind of film you simply enjoyed. It was an ordeal, a hallucinatory journey that left you shaken and uncertain. It was also a significant commercial success, making back its inflated budget and then some, ensuring that Francis would not be bankrupted by its excesses. But the cost had been enormous, not financially, but personally. Francis was exhausted, traumatized by the experience. He had wanted to make a great war film, and he had succeeded, but he had also learned the limits of his own endurance, learned that there were prices you could pay that were not measured in money. Apocalypse Now was a masterpiece, but it had nearly killed him. He would later say that he felt he had used up all his luck, all his creative energy, that the film had taken something out of him that he could not get back. He was 40 years old, and he had made 3 of the most important American films of the decade, and he did not know what to do next. He decided to do something different, something smaller and more personal. He had always loved musicals, had grown up with his father's music filling the house, and he wanted to make a film that would be a kind of Valentine to the genre, to the lush Technicolor romanticism of the Hollywood musicals he had watched as a boy. The result was One from the Heart, a stylized romance set in Las Vegas on the 4th of July, shot entirely on sound stages at his Zoetrope studio in San Francisco. The film was visually ravishing, every frame composed and lit like a painting, with elaborate sets and a dream-like atmosphere, the city rendered as a neon fantasy. The music was by Tom Waits, strange and beautiful. But the story weaves the soul, the characters underdeveloped, and the film felt more like an exercise in technique than a fully realized drama. It was also enormously expensive because Francis had built the entire Las Vegas Strip on a soundstage, and when it was released in 1982, It was a catastrophic commercial failure, earning a tiny fraction of its budget. The failure of one from the heart financially destroyed American zoetrope. Francis had poured his own money into the production, had leveraged his assets to build the studio, and now it was all gone. He was millions of dollars in debt, and the banks were calling in their loans. He had to sell his house, sell equipment, lay off staff, watch the dream of an independent studio collapse in real time. It was a humiliating reversal, and it marked the end of an era. The new Hollywood generation had been given creative freedom in the 70s because the studios were desperate and had nothing to lose. But by the early 1980s, the studios had regained control, had found a formula that worked: the blockbuster, the high-concept franchise film, the movies that played globally and spawned sequels and merchandising. There was no longer room for the kind of personal, idiosyncratic filmmaking that Francis and his peers had championed. The revolution was over, and it had lost. Francis spent the next decade essentially working as a hired director, taking jobs to pay off his debts. He made The Outsiders and Rumblefish, both adaptations of S.E. Hinton young adult novels, shot back-to-back in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The films were stylish, full of visual invention, but they were minor works, films that felt like experiments rather than major statements. He made The Cotton Club, a period drama about Harlem in the 20s, a production plagued by financial problems and creative interference, the script rewritten constantly, the budget spiraling. He made Gardens of Stone, a subdued drama about military funerals during the Vietnam War, shot while he was grieving the death of his son Gideon, who had been killed in a boating accident during the production of Gardens of Stone, a tragedy that shattered Francis and his family. The film is quiet, mournful, suffused with the weight of real grief. He made Tucker, The Man and His Dream, in 1988, a biopic about the maverick car designer Preston Tucker, and the film felt autobiographical, a story about a dreamer crushed by the system, someone with vision but no means to realize it, thwarted by the same institutional forces that had thwarted Francis. The film was warm and optimistic despite its melancholy subtext, and it was a modest success, but it was not the kind of film that would restore Francis to the pantheon. He was no longer the wonder kind, no longer the auteur with unlimited potential. He was a middle-aged director with a track record of commercial failures, someone the industry saw as talented but unreliable, someone whose best work was behind him. In 1990, Paramount convinced him to make The Godfather Part 3. He had resisted for years, had turned down offers, but he needed the money, and the studio made it worth his while. He co-wrote the script with Mario Puzo, bringing back Michael Corleone, now an old man trying to legitimize the family's business, trying to atone for his sins, and failing. The film was ambitious, reaching for the same tragic grandeur as the first two, but it was compromised by casting problems. His daughter Sophia was cast in a major role at the last minute after several other actresses dropped out, and she was not experienced enough to carry the weight the role required. The film was also rushed, the production schedule compressed, and it showed. When The Godfather Part 3 was released, it was met with disappointment, seen as a lesser work, an unnecessary coda to a perfect diptych. It was not a bad film, but it was not a great one, and that was damning for something that carried the Godfather name. The 1990s were a difficult decade for Francis. He was in his 50s, still in debt, still taking jobs to stay afloat. He made Bram Stoker's Dracula, a lush gothic horror film that was a commercial success, and it reminded audiences that he could still direct with visual flair, could still create images that burned into memory. But it did not feel like a major work, did not feel like something that would define him. He made Jack, a comedy drama about a boy who ages rapidly, and it was mawkish and misconceived, one of the worst reviewed films of his career. He made The Rainmaker, a legal thriller adapted from a John Grisham novel, and it was competent, professional, and entirely anonymous, the kind of film any skilled director could have made. He was working and he was surviving, but he was not making the films he wanted to make. He had ideas, projects he wanted to develop, but he could not get them financed. The industry had moved on. The auteur-driven cinema of the 70s was a historical curiosity. The new model was the franchise, the superhero film, the global blockbuster that could be marketed in every territory and turned into a multi-film series. There was no room for the kind of ambitious, personal filmmaking Francis had once represented. He became, in the eyes of many, a relic, a figure from another era, someone who had done great things once, but whose moment had passed. And yet he did not stop. He kept working, kept thinking about film, kept mentoring young filmmakers, kept running his winery in Napa Valley, which had become his primary source of income and stability. He watched his daughter Sophia become a major director in her own right, making films like Lost in Translation and The Virgin Suicides, films that carried echoes of his own sensibility but were entirely her own. He watched his nephew, Nicolas Cage, who had changed his last name to avoid trading on the family connection, become one of the biggest movie stars in the world. The Coppola family had become a dynasty, and Francis was its patriarch, a role that seemed appropriate given the films that had defined him. In the 2000s, he began working on a project he had been thinking about for decades, an epic science fiction film set in a futuristic New York, a film about an idealistic architect trying to rebuild the city into a utopia, a meditation on ambition and vision, and the possibility of creating a better world. The project was called Megalopolis, and it was everything the industry did not want: expensive, uncommercial, philosophically dense, a film that asked big questions and did not provide easy answers. No studio would finance it. Francis decided to finance it himself, to sell off parts of his winery, to use his own money to make the film the way he wanted, with no interference, no compromises. It was a return to the dream of independence, the dream that had driven him since the beginning, the belief that cinema could be art, that a filmmaker could have a vision and realize it without bending to market forces. Megalopolis took years to make, and when it was finally completed and released in 2024, it was met with reactions that ranged from bafflement to admiration. Some critics saw it as a folly, a vanity project, the indulgence of an aging director who had lost touch with contemporary cinema. Others saw it as a bold, visionary work, a film that swung for the fences and connected, a reminder of what cinema could be when a filmmaker was willing to take risks, to pursue a personal vision regardless of commercial considerations. The film was not a hit, but it was not meant to be. It was a statement, a culmination, a final assertion of the belief that had sustained Francis through all the failures and disappointments, that film was an art form, and that art mattered more than money. Looking back at Francis Ford Coppola's career, it is tempting to see it as a tragedy, a story of early greatness followed by decline, of a director who made two perfect films and then spent the rest of his life failing to recapture that perfection. But this reading misses something essential about the arc of his work and his life. Francis was never interested in repeating himself, never content to make the same film over and over. He wanted to explore, to experiment, to push the boundaries of what cinema could do, even if that meant failure, even if that meant financial ruin. His career is not a tragedy, but an adventure, the story of someone who chose risk over security, who chose ambition over comfort, who believed that the purpose of art was not to succeed, but to reach, to try for something just beyond your grasp. The two Godfather films remain towering achievements, films that have become part of the American cultural landscape, referenced and quoted and analyzed endlessly. They are films about power and family, about the immigrant experience, about the way America devours its own myths. They are also, in a sense, films about Francis himself, about the experience of succeeding on a scale that changes everything, that isolates you, that turns you into something you did not intend to become. Michael Corleone's transformation from idealistic outsider to ruthless patriarch mirrors, in some ways, Francis's own trajectory from scrappy, independent filmmaker to Hollywood titan. And the weight of that success, the way it constrains and defines you, is something Francis understood deeply. Apocalypse Now is a different kind of achievement. A film that documents not just the madness of the Vietnam War, but the madness of trying to make art at the limits of endurance. It is a film about obsession, about the way the pursuit of an ideal can destroy you, and it is impossible to watch the film without thinking about the production, about Francis in the jungle, trying to make sense of footage that seemed to resist coherence, trying to find meaning in chaos. The film's ambiguity, its refusal to provide easy answers, is part of what makes it endure. It is not a film that tells you what to think about the war. It is a film that immerses you in its hallucinatory logic and leaves you to find your own way out. The later films, the ones made after the collapse of Zoetrope, are harder to assess. Some are failures, some are minor works, some are films that reveal interesting things only on repeated viewing. But taken together, they represent a commitment to keep working, to keep trying, even when the industry had written him off, even when the financial pressures were overwhelming. Francis could have retired after Apocalypse Now, could have lived off the residuals from the Godfather films, could have spent his time making wine and giving interviews. But he kept making films, kept pushing, kept believing that cinema mattered. That persistence, that refusal to give up, is its own kind of heroism. His influence on American cinema is incalculable. He proved that a director could be an auteur, that you could make films that were both commercially successful and artistically ambitious, that you did not have to choose between art and popular appeal. He mentored a generation of filmmakers, giving George Lucas the space to develop Star Wars, supporting the early work of Carroll Ballard and Philip Kaufman, and many others. He pioneered digital filmmaking technology, understanding early that the future of cinema would be shaped by digital tools and using his resources to develop and promote those tools. He built a family of artists, a dynasty that has continued to shape American culture. He made films that have become part of the language, scenes and lines and images that are instantly recognizable even to people who have never seen the films in full. But perhaps his most important legacy is the example of his career itself, the way it demonstrates that a life in art is not a straight line, not a steady ascent to ever greater triumphs. It is a series of risks, of failures and recoveries, of reaching for something you cannot quite achieve and trying again differently. Francis made great films, and he made failed films, and he made films that do not fit easily into either category. He was wildly successful, and he was bankrupt and he rebuilt himself. He was celebrated and he was dismissed and he kept working. He believed in cinema as an art form capable of expressing the full range of human experience, and he spent his life trying to prove it, and whether he succeeded or failed on any given project mattered less than the fact that he never stopped trying. In the final years of his life, Francis has become an elder statesman, a figure who represents a lost era of American filmmaking, someone who embodies both the possibilities and the limitations of auteur cinema. He gives interviews where he talks about the old days, about making The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, and there is a wistfulness in his voice, a sense that something has been lost, that cinema is no longer what it was, that the industry has become risk-averse and formulaic. And there is truth in that. The kind of films Francis made in the 70s, the mid-budget auteur-driven dramas and epics, are rare now, almost non-existent in the studio system. But there is also a sense that he does not regret the choices he made, the risks he took, the money he lost, and the money he made. He lived the life he wanted to live, made the films he wanted to make, and if the results were uneven, if the career did not have the clean arc of a Hollywood narrative, well, that is the nature of a real life, as opposed to a scripted one. He is often photographed now in his vineyard, surrounded by grapevines and sunlight, a patriarch in the literal sense, someone who has built something that will outlast him. The winery is successful, producing wines that are respected and profitable, and it has become a symbol of the way Francis has diversified, has found ways to sustain himself beyond filmmaking. But even in retirement, even in the comfortable final chapter, there is the sense that he is still thinking about cinema, still imagining projects, still believing that there is something left to say, something left to make. Megalopolis was supposed to be his final statement, the culmination of a lifetime of thinking about art and society and the possibility of utopia, but it is hard to imagine Francis truly stopping, truly accepting that the work is done. The Godfather films are his monument, the work that will define him in the eyes of history. They are films that have been absorbed into the culture so completely that it is hard to remember a time when they did not exist. The images are iconic: Marlon Brando in the shadowed study, the horse head in the bed, the restaurant shooting, the baptism intercut with murders, Al Pacino's face closing like a door in the final shot of Part 2. The lines have become part of the language. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. Leave the gun, take the cannoli. Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. The films are quoted and parodied and referenced constantly, and that ubiquity is both a testament to their power and a kind of burden, because it makes it hard to see them clearly, to watch them as films rather than as cultural artifacts. But if you can watch them with fresh eyes, if you can set aside the weight of their reputation and just experience them as cinema, what you find is something remarkable. A vision of America that is both loving and damning, a portrait of family that is both warm and suffocating, a tragedy that unfolds with the inevitability of myth. The films are long and slow, but they do not feel slow. They feel immersive, novelistic, patient in the way that great novels are patient. They trust the audience to pay attention, to follow the relationships and the power dynamics, to understand the silences and the glances, the way meaning accumulates across scenes and across hours. They are films that reward repeated viewing, that reveal new layers each time you return to them. And at the center of it all is the figure of Michael Corleone, one of the great tragic characters in American art. Al Pacino's performance across the two films is a miracle of control, a slow modulation from warmth to coldness, from openness to inscrutability. In the first film, Michael is a man trying to escape his family's legacy, trying to become something other than what his father is, and then, through a series of choices that feel both inevitable and freely made, he becomes exactly what he feared. In the second film, he is a man trying to hold on to power, to protect what he has built, and in doing so he destroys everything that gave that power meaning. His wife leaves him, his brother betrays him and must be killed, his mother dies without reconciling with him, his sister hates him, and in the end he is alone, powerful, and empty, a ghost in his own life. It is a portrait of success as damnation, and it is devastating. Francis understood something essential about the American experience, about the way ambition and violence are intertwined, about the way the pursuit of success requires moral compromise, about the way families are both the source of identity and the site of the deepest wounds. He understood this not just intellectually, but viscerally, because he had lived it, had experienced the exhilaration of success and the isolation it brings, had felt the pressure of expectation, had made compromises, and suffered losses. The Godfather films are personal in a way that is not always obvious, because they are not autobiographical in any literal sense, but they are infused with Francis's own experience of being Italian-American, of coming from a family that was both loving and demanding, of trying to succeed in an industry that was indifferent and often hostile, of achieving success and finding that it did not solve the problems you thought it would solve. The films are also, in a formal sense, extraordinary pieces of filmmaking. Gordon Willis's cinematography creates a visual world of shadow and texture, where darkness is always pressing in at the edges of the frame, where light is a rare and precious thing. The compositions are classical, balanced, formal, but never static. The camera moves slowly, deliberately, revealing information, creating suspense, directing the viewer's attention with absolute precision. Mino Rota's score is one of the great film scores, blending Italian folk melodies with orchestral grandeur, creating a musical language that is at once intimate and epic. The editing is patient, building scenes through accumulation rather than through rapid cutting, trusting the performances, the silences, the weight of what is not said. The production design is meticulous, creating a world that feels lived in and real, every detail considered, every texture authentic. The casting is perfect, not just the leads but the supporting roles, the character actors who populate the world and make it feel inhabited, populated, dense with life. Francis's genius was not just in the individual elements, but in the way he orchestrated them, the way he understood that cinema is a synthetic art, that the power of a film comes from the interaction of image and sound, and performance, and music and editing, all working together to create an experience that is more than the sum of its parts. He learned this from the Europeans, from Fellini and Visconti and Kurosawa, directors who understood that cinema could be as rich and complex as literature, that a film could have layers, could be about multiple things at once, could ask questions without providing answers. But he also understood that American cinema had its own strengths, its own traditions, its commitment to narrative clarity and emotional directness, and he found a way to synthesize the two, to make films that were artistically ambitious but also accessible, that could reach a mass audience and also be taken seriously by critics and scholars. This synthesis was the great achievement of the new Hollywood generation, and Francis was its most successful exemplar. For a brief period in the 1970s, American cinema was making films for adults, films that dealt with complex themes and moral ambiguity, films that did not talk down to their audiences, and those films were also, miraculously, commercially successful. The Godfather was the biggest hit of its time, and it was also a serious work of art. That combination seems almost impossible now, in an era when the most commercially successful films are superhero movies and franchises aimed at global audiences, and the serious films are relegated to the margins, to streaming services and limited releases. The industry has bifurcated, and the middle ground that Francis and his peers occupied has largely disappeared. But the films remain. The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 are not relics. They are living works, films that continue to speak to new generations, that continue to be discovered and rediscovered, that continue to reward attention and analysis. They are part of the canon now, part of the cultural inheritance, and they will endure as long as people care about cinema. Apocalypse now is the same, a film that has only grown in stature over the decades, that has come to be seen as one of the essential films about war, about the darkness at the heart of the American project, about the way ideology and violence spiral into madness. These three films, made over a span of 7 years, represent a peak in American cinema, a moment when everything came together, when a filmmaker's vision and the resources to realize it and the cultural moment all aligned. The rest of the career is messier, harder to assess, but no less interesting for that. Francis's willingness to fail, his refusal to play it safe, his insistence on pursuing projects that might not work, makes the career as a whole more compelling than it would have been if he had simply repeated his successes. He could have made Godfather films for the rest of his life, and he would have been wealthy and celebrated, but he chose not to. He chose to risk everything to make Apocalypse Now, and then he chose to risk everything again to make one, From the Heart, and both times he nearly destroyed himself, but he did not stop. That willingness to risk everything in pursuit of a vision, even when the odds are against you, even when the rational choice is to walk away, is the mark of a true artist, someone for whom the work is not a career, but a calling. And so Francis Ford Coppola remains a paradox, a figure who is both celebrated and overlooked, both canonical and undervalued. The two Godfather films have overshadowed everything else he did. And that overshadowing is both deserved, because those films are masterpieces, and unfortunate because it obscures the scope and ambition of the rest of the work. He is a patriarch, a dynast, someone who built a legacy that extends beyond his own films to include the work of his children and the filmmakers he mentored and the technologies he pioneered. He is also, in the end, a man who loved cinema, who believed in its possibilities, who spent his life trying to make films that mattered, and who succeeded more often than not, and who failed gloriously when he did fail. There is a photograph of him from the set of Apocalypse Now, standing in the jungle in a sweat-soaked shirt, looking exhausted and haunted, a man at the limits of his endurance. It is an image that captures something essential about his career, the willingness to go to the edge, to risk everything, to pursue a vision even when it is destroying you. And there is another photograph, taken decades later, of him in his vineyard, gray-haired and smiling, a man at peace, surrounded by the fruits of his labor, literal and metaphorical. Both images are true. Both are Francis. The films remain and they will endure, and that is what matters. The Godfather and its sequel, monuments of American cinema, epic in scope and intimate in feeling, films about family and power and the American dream and the cost of success, films that have been absorbed into the culture and yet remain vital and strange and capable of surprising you even when you think you know them. Apocalypse Now, a film about war and madness, about the heart of darkness, a film that is also about the act of making the film, about the way art and life bleed into each other, about obsession and vision and the price you pay for both. And then the rest of the work, the minor films and the failures and the experiments, the films made for money and the films made for love, all of it part of a career that spanned more than half a century. All of it part of a life lived in pursuit of something that can never be fully captured, but that was worth pursuing nonetheless. Francis Ford Coppola believed in cinema. He believed it could be art. He believed it could matter. He spent his life trying to prove it, and the proof is there, in the films, in the images that endure, in the stories that continue to be told. The world he was born into, the industrial queens of the 1940s, the world of polio and television, and the immigrant striver's dream, is gone now, part of history. The world he helped create, the new Hollywood of the 1970s, is gone too, swept away by the blockbuster era and the franchise model, and the globalization of cinema. But the films remain, and they speak across time, and they will continue to speak as long as people watch them, as long as people care about stories and images and the mysterious alchemy by which moving pictures become something more than the sum of their parts, become art, become a way of understanding the world and our place in it. And so the story ends, not with a conclusion, but with a continuation, because the work goes on. The films continue to be watched. The influence continues to spread. The legacy continues to unfold. Francis is old now, in the final chapter, but the films are young as the people who discover them, as young as the medium itself, which despite everything, despite the changes and the compromises and the betrayals, remains capable of wonder, remains capable of making us feel and think and see. The lights dim, the film begins, and for 2 hours or 3 we enter another world, a world made of light and shadow and sound. A world that Francis and others like him brought into being through sheer force of will and imagination and love. And when the film ends and the lights come up, we return to our own world, but we are changed, however slightly, by what we have seen. That is the power of cinema, and that is what Francis Ford Coppola understood and devoted his life to, and that is what endures, beyond success and failure, beyond triumph and disaster, beyond the rise and fall of reputations and the changing fashions of the industry. The work endures, and it speaks, and it will continue to speak long after the man who made it has become just another name in the credits, another figure in the history of an art form that somehow, against all odds, continues to matter,